You hear the sound of footsteps in the hallway, slow, deliberate, coming closer. You're lying in darkness, and you know what's coming. You've known since the day you arrived at this plantation. Tonight, like so many nights before, she will open your door, and you have no choice but to obey. This is the story no one wanted to tell. The horrors endured by enslaved black men at the hands of white-widowed mistresses in the antebellum South. History remembers the brutality of overseers and the cruelty of masters, but it buried something else: the sexual violence inflicted by women who held absolute power over the men they owned. What happened behind locked doors in those plantation houses was so disturbing that even abolitionists hesitated to speak of it. For over a century, these stories remained hidden in whispered testimonies, coded diary entries, and the silence of descendants too ashamed to repeat what their ancestors endured. I'd love to know where you're watching from. It still amazes me that stories this buried, this painful, can finally reach people across every continent who want to understand the full truth of what happened. The year is 1847, and across the American South, a peculiar and deeply disturbing pattern has emerged. White widows, women whose husbands have died leaving them in control of plantations and the human beings enslaved there, have discovered they possess a form of power that society will never openly acknowledge but rarely punishes. They own men. Not just their labor, but their bodies. And the law, the church, and Southern society have created a system where these men have absolutely no recourse, no protection, and no voice. The archives reveal what polite society refused to document. In the papers of the American Anti-Slavery Society, buried among thousands of testimonies collected between 1830 and 1865, are accounts that abolitionists struggled to publish. Former enslaved people, speaking decades after emancipation, described what they called night visits, a euphemism for sexual assault that occurred with such regularity it became an expected horror of plantation life. One man, interviewed in 1929 as part of the Federal Writers Project, was 87 years old when he finally spoke. His voice, captured by a white interviewer who seemed uncomfortable writing down his words, described being 17 when his master died, and the master's 34-year-old widow took control of the estate. "She sent for me every night for 3 years," he said, "and if I didn't come quick enough, she'd have me whipped the next morning." The interviewer noted that the old man wept as he spoke, then crossed out several lines of testimony, writing only, "Details too disturbing to record." What made these situations uniquely horrific was the complete absence of escape. An enslaved woman assaulted by a master might find sympathy from the master's wife, might appeal to religious authorities, might, in rare cases, have her situation acknowledged as wrong, even if unpunished. But an enslaved man assaulted by a white woman existed in a category that Southern society refused to recognize. To acknowledge it would be to admit that white women could desire black men, which contradicted every foundational myth of white supremacy. To speak of it was to risk being accused of the very thing that could get a black man lynched, suggesting sexual contact between black men and white women. The system had created a perfect trap. The violence happened in silence, and the silence ensured the violence continued. Consider Sarah Fenton, a widow in Charleston County, South Carolina, who inherited 43 enslaved people when her husband died in 1831. She was 31 years old. Among her property was a man named Samuel, 18 years old, described in the plantation ledger as prime field hand, strong, healthy. Within weeks of her husband's burial, enslaved people on neighboring plantations began whispering. Samuel was seen leaving the main house at dawn. Other enslaved men on the Fenton plantation were warned by older slaves. "Do what she says, all of it, or you'll end up in the ground." A traveling minister who visited the plantation in 1833 wrote in his private diary, never published until 1978, that he sensed something ungodly in that household, a shame that hangs in the air. He never specified what he meant, but he noted that Mrs. Fenton kept a particular manservant who seems exhausted beyond his years, and that she flew into rage when the minister suggested she might consider remarrying. The psychological dimensions of this abuse were deliberately ignored by everyone who might have intervened. These weren't relationships. They were repeated sexual assaults backed by the threat of violence, sale, or death. The women involved held power that was nearly absolute. They could order whippings. They could sell family members. They could work men to death in the fields. And they could, with complete impunity, demand sexual access to men who had no legal right to refuse. Some widows developed elaborate justifications. They convinced themselves they were providing special treatment, better food, lighter work, private quarters, to the men they repeatedly assaulted. They told themselves it was mutual, consensual, even desired. This delusion was possible only because the law had defined enslaved people as property without will or desire of their own. If a man couldn't legally refuse, then in the twisted logic of slavery, he also couldn't be unwilling. The testimonies that survive are fragmentary but consistent. A formerly enslaved man interviewed in Virginia in 1897 described his mother warning him when he turned 16. "If the mistress calls for you, you go. You do what she wants. You don't tell nobody, because they'll kill you for even speaking about it." Another man, interviewed in Georgia, described being forced to share his enslaved wife's cabin with the widow who owned them both, a psychological torture where his partner had to witness his assault and pretend not to see it. "She destroyed everything between us," he said, "made it so I couldn't look at my woman without shame. That was part of what she wanted, to break something in us that couldn't never be fixed. The system created predators and then protected them. Because Southern law defined rape as something that could only happen to white women, and because enslaved people legally couldn't testify against white people, there was no mechanism by which these crimes could even theoretically be prosecuted. A white widow could sexually assault enslaved men for decades, and unless she was extraordinarily indiscreet, no social consequences would follow. Church communities knew. Neighbors suspected. Other white women understood exactly what was happening. But the silence held because acknowledging it would crack the foundation of white supremacy, the myth that white women were pure, passive, and desired only white men, and that black men were dangerous predators rather than victims. Some widows became notorious even within the culture of silence. There was Elizabeth Wentworth of Savannah, who went through 11 house servants in 14 years, each young man mysteriously requesting to be sold or running away despite brutal consequences. There was Margaret Daniels of Louisiana, whose plantation saw 3 enslaved men die under suspicious circumstances after they were observed leaving her residence at night, with whispers that they'd been poisoned after threatening to speak about what happened. These weren't isolated monsters. They were women operating within a system that gave them absolute power and no accountability, a combination that reveals what human beings are capable of when all restraints are removed. The physical consequences were documented even when the crimes weren't named. Medical records from plantation hospitals, yes, some large plantations kept medical logs, show patterns of injuries to young male slaves that doctors recorded without comment. Venereal diseases that spread from mistresses to enslaved men, then to the enslaved women those men were partnered with, creating chains of infection that destroyed families. Psychological breakdowns described as melancholy or madness in men who'd been repeatedly assaulted. Some men self-mutilated to make themselves unattractive. Some attempted suicide. Others broke completely, becoming what overseers called mindless or simple. Men so traumatized they'd dissociated from reality entirely. When abolitionists encountered these testimonies, they faced an agonizing dilemma. Publishing them might undermine their cause. Northern audiences were already skeptical of the more extreme accounts of slavery's horrors. Stories of white women as sexual predators would be dismissed as impossible, as slander against Southern womanhood, as proof that abolitionists were willing to lie. Even sympathetic readers struggled with accounts that contradicted everything they believed about gender, power and desire. The result was silence from the very people who might have given these men's voices a hearing. Frederick Douglass wrote privately about unspeakable crimes committed by women of standing, but never published details. Harriet Beecher Stowe heard testimonies that made her weep but kept them out of Uncle Tom's Cabin, knowing they'd destroy her credibility. The men's voices were erased twice, once by the system that enabled their abuse, again by reformers who thought the truth was too damaging to tell. After emancipation, the silence deepened rather than lifted. Formerly enslaved men who'd experienced this abuse almost never spoke of it publicly. The shame was too deep, the fear too ingrained. In a society where black men were being lynched for even looking at white women wrong, admitting you'd been forced into sexual contact with a white woman was to invite violence. The psychological term for this didn't exist yet, but we recognize it now. Male sexual assault survivors often carry deeper shame and longer silence than female survivors because society refuses to acknowledge men as victims of sexual violence. For black men in the post-Civil War South, speaking about what white women had done to them was literally life-threatening. The few accounts that exist came from men interviewed in extreme old age, speaking to black interviewers, usually insisting on anonymity even decades after the fact. One man, interviewed in 1936 at age 92, spent an hour describing brutal field labor, family separations, and physical torture before mentioning, almost as an afterthought, "The worst thing she did, I can't say, but it happened at night, and it happened for years, and when she finally sold me, I thanked God even though it meant leaving my children behind. That's how bad it was, worse than being sold." The interviewer noted the man's hands shook so badly he couldn't continue. Modern historians discovered this hidden history not through dramatic revelations, but through painful detective work, reading between the lines of plantation records, noting suspicious patterns in estate documents, comparing testimonies that used careful euphemisms, analyzing the architectural layouts of plantation houses where certain quarters had private entrances to the main house. They found medical records showing widows treating venereal diseases at the same time their young male slaves were being treated. They found wills where widows left suspiciously generous provisions to enslaved men described as faithful personal servants, while leaving nothing to the mothers of their own children. They found diary entries from white women on neighboring plantations making veiled references to disgraceful conduct and unnatural appetites that brought shame to respectable widowhood. What emerges from this evidence isn't a story of a few deviant individuals, but of systematic abuse enabled by absolute power and protected by willful ignorance. These women weren't monsters born, but monsters made, created by a system that told them other human beings were property for their use, in every way, without restriction. The horror isn't that some people abused such power. The horror is that the society around them looked away, that the law provided no remedy, that the victims had no voice, and that for over a century afterward, we chose to forget it happened. The psychological damage rippled through generations. Men who'd been assaulted became fathers unable to protect their own sons from similar abuse. Women who'd witnessed their partner's assaults carried rage and grief they couldn't express. Children born from these assaults existed in a category of violation that nobody acknowledged, denied by white families, whispered about in black communities, growing up knowing they were products of violence but unable to name it. The silence became inheritance, passed down as shame without story, as trauma without testimony. Today, scattered across the South, there are descendants who carry family stories they've never fully told. An elderly man in South Carolina knows why his great-great-grandfather never spoke about his time on the Fenton plantation. A woman in Georgia has letters that hint at why her ancestor fled to Ohio in 1867, leaving family behind and never returned. These fragments exist in attics and memories, pieces of truth that were too dangerous to speak and too painful to forget. The archives hold one more document that deserves mentioning. In 1889, 42 years after that night when footsteps came down the hallway, A man named Samuel wrote a letter to his daughter. He was 66 years old, living in Philadelphia, dying of tuberculosis. He'd been free for 24 years, but had never told his family what happened to him in South Carolina. The letter, preserved by his great-granddaughter and donated to a university archive in 1994, contains one paragraph that took him 4 decades to write. They will tell you slavery was about cotton and labor and economics. That is true. But what they will not tell you is what happened when the sun went down, when the doors closed, when there was no one to hear you say no. What they will not tell you is that some of us endured things that have no names, violations that the law did not recognize and history will not record. I am telling you because someone must. I am telling you so you know that we survived not just work, but what came after work. Remember us for that, for surviving what should have destroyed us. His daughter saved the letter but never showed it to anyone while she lived. She passed it to her daughter with a note that said simply, "He wanted the truth remembered, even if it took 100 years. It has taken longer than that. But the truth, once buried, always finds its way to light. And in the finding, perhaps, we finally allow those men to be seen not as property, not as abstractions, but as human beings who endured the unendurable and whose survival demands our witness."